ago, I covered the Win 2 from GPD, and now, better late than never, I will be taking a look at the Win 4 from GPD, which provides a very different form factor from the Win 2. GPD is definitely no stranger to x86 handhelds and has many years of experience iterating on their Win handheld line to arrive at their latest, the Win 4. It's clear that from those years of experience, they were able to craft a device that promises to pack a good amount of power into a very small package. Equipped with the Ryzen 7 6800U and combines a built-in keyboard among other neat features into one of the smallest packages seen with this chipset. So does the Win 4 improve on its predecessor, the Win 3? My name is Rob, the Retro Tech Dad, and together let's explore the Win 4, and as the saying goes, better late than never. So let's briefly cover the specs of the Win 4, which comes equipped with the AMD Ryzen 7 6800U with 8 cores, 16 threads, and a max boost of 4.7 GHz. The 6800U comes with the Radeon 680M graphics based on RDNA 2 with 12 CU and 768 shaders. It's equipped with a 6-inch 1080 by 1920 16:9 IPS display that offers a 368 ppi. My specific model comes with 16GB of LPDDR5 RAM, but the Win 4 is available with up to 32GB of LPDDR5 RAM. In addition, my specific model has 1TB of M.2 NVMe 2280 internal storage and is available in configurations from 512GB to 2TB. The Win 4 does have the option to expand storage with the microSD slot, as well as providing 2 USB Type-C ports, one of which supports USB 4.0, and it also supports Wi-Fi 6 802.11ax with Bluetooth 5.2, and finally it comes powered with a 45.6 Wh battery and Windows 11 Home 64-bit out of the box. The GPD Win 4 is available now, and this specific unit was provided to me by the folks at Geekbuying.com for the purpose of this review. They did not ask to see this video before publishing and did not have any specific requirements for this video. I'm very excited to be able to work with Geekbuying as they have been around for many years, and it was actually a website that I was familiar with and have personally used in the past. They happen to be celebrating their 11th year in business, and Geekbuying is offering a promotional price and coupon for my viewers, which I will have linked down in the description. The US and EU models will be available for $799 and 799 euros respectively, which makes this a pretty competitive price for the GPD Win 4 through Geekbuying.com. Okay, it's time to get this Win 4 unboxed, and I can already tell this is going to be pretty substantial just based on the heftiness of the box. GPD likes to go very minimalistic with their packaging, so we'll do a quick look around, but I suspect there won't be much on here. You can see here that I do have the 16GB 1TB configuration of the Win 4. Alright, let's get this box cover off so we can start checking out the contents of this package. This was definitely unexpected, and GPD certainly has a way of inspiring me with their quality, innovation, extreme service. And let's get this flap lifted up and over, and it appears we have another inspiring quote. This one reads, "Actions speak louder than words." Certainly something to think about. Let's gently take the Win 4 out of the package and put it aside briefly as we continue to make our way through the contents of this box. It looks like we have the Win 4 user manual, which details the inputs and specifications of the device, which is pretty standard stuff. In the back of the package, we have an included lanyard and the USB Type-C to Type-C cable, which seems to be a pretty nice length. On the other side of this smaller box, we have the included 65-watt power adapter, which is nice and hefty and understandable given its capabilities. Alright, let's get this out of the way and bring back the Win 4 into the spotlight. The unit does include a screen protector designed for the Win 4, which is always nice to have out of the box. Here's a closer look at the insert protecting the Win 4. I have to say, just from my first impression of holding the Win 4 in my hand, and the size of this device just absolutely blows me away. I'm really impressed by what GPD was able to accomplish here. Everything so far feels really nice, and it is quite a substantial unit. It definitely does not feel cheap at all. And with that, I think it's time to start our tour around the device. Starting from the top right, and you can see that the Win 4 is using a stacked shoulder configuration with analog triggers for the R2. I really love the finishing on the R1, and we will talk more about the design in a little bit, but the R1 button is obviously inspired by the PlayStation Portable right down to the shape. The R1 has a very nice and light click to them and are pressing down well from all points. I really do like the action of this R1 button. Now taking a closer look at the R2, and this has a very nice and smooth movement with a good amount of travel. No issues with the finishing, and as I said, it does press down smoothly. Alright, coming around to the top and moving from the right to left, we have the 3.5mm headphone port, the standard USB Type-A port, which I definitely like seeing here, a USB Type-C, which is USB 4.0, the large exhaust vent below that, volume up and down buttons, and finally the power button. And on the left side, the shoulder button and trigger, which like the right side is pressing down nicely, and there is smooth movement on the trigger. Moving down the left side, here is where we have the micro SD slot for storage expansion, the gamepad and mouse mode switch, and you can see some of that nice textured backing for the grip on the back. Continuing on to the bottom of the unit, and you can see the opening for a lanyard, which is very reminiscent of the PlayStation Vita and PlayStation Portable. In fact, the trim going around the entirety of the unit is similar to a PSP. Finally, on the bottom, we have the additional USB Type-C. Moving along to the right side of the unit, and here we have the reset switch, which is used for the BIOS. Alright, time to check out the back of the unit, and you can see that we have the programmable buttons on each grip, and then the massive intake vent for cooling. So let's now go front side and check out one of the defining features of the Win4, which is the secret keyboard that's hidden away under its 6-inch screen. This is also a good opportunity to check out that sliding mechanism for the screen. On the left side, we have the Alps-based analog sticks, which have good movement, and the analog stick cap is smaller, but it is sized according to the unit. Here you can see how the analog stick sits above the face of the device. Moving down to the D-pad, which is very reminiscent and similar to the PlayStation Vita style D-pad. GPD definitely likes to use this style of D-pad for their devices, and it has a very nice and light clickiness to it, which I find very satisfying to use. The D-pad itself doesn't have a lot of movement or range, which makes it slightly different than the one that you see on the Vita. Below the D-pad, we have the fingerprint sensor for security features, and one of the front-firing stereo speakers and the select button. Okay, now on the right side of the unit, here we have the face buttons that again are very reminiscent of the PlayStation Vita, but I do think these are sized a little bit smaller, but we will measure that later on. Again, these are clicky and use dome-style switches. GPD always puts the small detail in their face buttons, which includes both the ABXY Xbox style print as well as the PlayStation icons in a smaller size. I've always liked this little detail. These do press down well and again have that satisfying clickiness, but not a lot of travel. They do stay a little bit above the face of the unit. Below the face button, we have the other analog stick, and again, smooth movement as well as a solid click-in for the R3 functionality. Moving down further, and we have the optical pointer, which is another great feature of the Win4 and will allow for really easy navigation within the Windows environment. Finally, the other front-firing stereo speaker, start, and menu buttons. Okay, with that tour around the device out of the way, it's time to turn the Win4 on for the first time and see what awaits us. As I mentioned earlier, this comes with Windows 11 out of the box, and so this will have the typical Windows 11 setup process, and expect this to take anywhere from 10 to 20 minutes to get to the point of reaching the Windows desktop. During this process, expect to enter your Wi-Fi information, sign into your Microsoft account, and go through some Windows updates as needed. Okay, let's quickly get past this point so we can reach the desktop and check out what's been included there. Finally, here we are at the Windows 11 desktop, and this is a standard install of Windows 11, which means it will come with the typical suite of Microsoft preloaded software that you will most likely want to remove. The only additional software that GPD has added is the Motion Assistant, Win Controls, and the GPD Guide on the desktop. These are all useful tools, and so let's go over them briefly. Starting off with Motion Assistant, and this is a pretty standard thing that GPD includes with their devices, and if you've been around with me since the WinMax 2, this will look familiar. It's nothing fancy, but for what it can do, it does it pretty well, and most importantly, it is stable. So with Motion Assistant on screen, immediately you'll notice that this tool is used to set some performance tweaks to your liking. From here, we can set our own custom TDP limit, lock the GPU to specific frequencies, or use the established presets. As I said, this tool works well and is fairly straightforward to use. There are other things that can be adjusted, including some of the gyro capabilities. I've personally tested this feature in emulation such as PlayStation 3, simulating the 6-axis controller, and it does work well. Moving along, you can set hotkeys for specific functions such as being able to adjust TDP based on 1 watt increments or loading a preset TDP. Finally, you can make adjustments to the device and change things like resolution and refresh rate. In the Advanced tab, you can set the tool to start with Windows among other tweaks to how the tool performs. You will also notice at the time that you can create different profiles based on what you have set. Overall, I find Motion Assistant to be a useful tool, and for something out of the box, it does work pretty well. Now, it's not the most elegant piece of software, but sometimes function over form, which is definitely the case here. Okay, moving to the Win Controls tool, and here we will be able to make some customization settings. Again, this is a simple tool, but does work as expected. In the first option, we can customize the function of the back buttons, as seen here, and finally for the mouse model customization option, you can tweak how the device performs when toggled into mouse mode. Additionally, hidden away in this section is the ability to modify the RGB lighting that is built into the shoulder triggers. Now on my unit, the RGB is barely visible, so I keep it off. Apparently GPD made a batch of Win4s that had a darker plastic but have since reverted back to the clear shoulder buttons, so they should be visible on newer units. Now there are some advantages to covering the device a little later, and I can give a few recommendations as well as some tips to make the experience a little bit better. The first thing you'll want to do after getting to that Windows 11 desktop is to head on over to the GPD website and download the latest drivers and firmware for the device, which does fix a few issues that were found in the past few months. As always, I will have all links available in the description box. Another great thing to do with your Win4, and something that I use personally, is the handheld control panel by Project SBC. This tool has come a long way, and the refined version you are seeing on screen is actually a fairly new release and a culmination of all of the progress and iteration that the software has gone through. I definitely recommend heading to their GitHub page and downloading the new handheld control panel overlay, which will allow you to do many of the same functions as Motion Assistant, but in a cleaner and more functional way. Finally, and similar to my WinMax 2 video, the great GPD community has put together a fantastic GitHub page which serves as a guide for new GPD Win4 owners. It's an excellent resource and a good read for anyone that is looking to get the most and best experience out of the Win4, as well as cover useful tools, settings, and issues. Let's talk a little about the build quality of the Win4. And again, it's a pretty substantial device. It's definitely got a heftiness to it. With the screen down, I could not get any kind of flexing in the shell. It's about as rigid as it can get and just very solid overall. There isn't too much rattling and everything is tight and finished well. I do really like the face of the Win4. It's got a very smooth and matte finish, which feels very nice and premium. On the back side, the GPD logo, for example, is etched into the plastic, which is a nice touch and does add to some of that premium design. And as I said earlier, everything presses down properly, there's no weird finishing issues with the triggers or buttons. Now of course, one area I do have concerns with is the sliding screen and mostly the mechanism. While it's quite solid right now, I do worry about the longevity of the mechanism and how well it will hold up after repeated use. However, GPD has done this type of style before with the Win3, and I don't believe I've heard of reports of that mechanism failing, so I am hopeful that it will hold up. Other than that, the sliding function works well, it's pretty smooth and locks in when reaching a certain height. The display is also quite nice, and GPD is using a 1080p panel, which at the 6-inch screen size results in a very sharp image. The viewing angles are excellent and colors are vibrant with pretty solid brightness that adjusts well for dark rooms and highlight situations. I will say that at times I found myself a little frustrated by the smaller display and have definitely grown to appreciate larger panels on other handhelds, but I do understand that this device is specifically designed to be as compact as possible. The front-firing speakers were a nice surprise for me, and during my battery testing, I had actually set the volume to 50% and was amazed by how loud they were at that setting. I do like that they are front-firing, and looking at the shape and design of the Win4, you might worry that your hands will block the speakers, but I personally haven't found that to be an issue. And here's an example of the Win4 at 100% volume. And yeah, I think it sounds really good and it doesn't get distorted at higher levels. One last note I wanted to make was just how well that fan moves air out of the exhaust vent. You can see just how far away I have my hand from the point of where I can actually feel the air flowing from the device. Unfortunately, that does come at a cost, as the fan is quite audible, especially when pushing it harder. And finally, let's check out this D-pad and see how it holds up in my usual fighting game go-to, which is Marvel vs. Capcom 2 for Dreamcast. I found this to be pretty responsive, and it does allow me to hit those combos and make movements pretty accurately, and you can see that I'm having no issues being consistent. I do think the Vita D-pad has slightly better movement, especially with pivoting, and I found the one on the Win4 to be a bit stiffer, but it is pretty good overall and definitely one of the better ones I've used. Now, one of the obvious advantages and points of difference for the Win4 is the inclusion of a built-in keyboard and dedicated optical mouse pointer, and I just can't stress this enough, but it really is a pleasure having that physical keyboard always available to you. There's no need to fiddle with on-screen keyboards that can be unreliable on Windows, and being able to just slide up the screen and then have access to all the shortcuts that you want is really great. Ironically, when I first started using the Win4, I was using it like some of my other Windows handhelds and had to actually break out of the habit of trying to navigate Windows without the keyboard. Of course, now when I go back to other Windows devices, I end up missing that keyboard. But I have to say that the biggest surprise for me was the optical pointer, and for me, really is the game changer on this device. It's always there, and forget needing to use the analog stick as a mouse, this optical pointer is incredibly accurate, reliable, and has the functions you expect like left and right click. It's very much similar to the later BlackBerry models that use something similar. The combination of the two make navigating Windows a bit easier and allows you to deal with some of the issues that can arise from navigating within Windows. So I thought it would be interesting to talk specifically about the design elements of the Win4, which obviously is very inspired by the PlayStation Portable and Vita. And it just so happens that I have both a Vita 2000 and a PSP 2000 here, so let's take a look and compare some of those similarities. Personally, I think this is a blend between both PlayStation devices, and in many ways has more similarities to the PSP than one might think. For the Vita, it's clear that the Win4 is influenced by the D-pad and face buttons that are being used on the device. The face buttons in particular are almost identical in the way they press down and feel. Now, the D-pad is very close to the Vita style one, but the one on the Win4, as I mentioned, is a bit stiffer with less movement. However, it is still a solid D-pad. You can see on the Vita how the D-pad has more movement. Now, the shoulder buttons on the Vita are pretty different than the one on the Win4, and I'd say that the PSP style shoulder buttons are actually much more in line with the design used on the Win4. The shape of these shoulder buttons on the PSP match closely with the Win4. Now, in terms of how they press down and feel, the Win4 is completely different from both the Vita 2000 and PSP shoulder buttons. In fact, I actually really like what GPD did here with theirs, which has a very light clickiness to them. I'd say shape-wise, the Win4 is closer to the Vita, and both PlayStation devices have loops for lanyards, which is another clear inspiration on the Win4. Finally, the trim around the Win4 resembles that of the PlayStation Portable. However, while the Win4 has clear influences, I do think it stands on its own, and GPD has done a nice job with the design overall for the unit. Alright, let's bring in some other devices into the mix and size up the Win4 against some of its counterparts. You can see we have a nice spread of devices here, and one very obvious thing that stands out is just how compact the Win4 is in terms of width. It is really quite impressive. So let's directly compare the size of the Win with the Steam Deck, and for sure the Steam Deck will absolutely dwarf the Win4's size. I think this is an area where you can really appreciate the compactness of the Win4. And next up we have a newcomer to the fold with the Asus ROG Ally, and the Ally is slightly smaller than the Steam Deck, but again, compared to the Win4, it's much larger in comparison. Here's the OG Nintendo Switch with the Joy-Cons attached, and this device is also larger in terms of width compared to the Win4. Finally, I decided to bring in my Odin Lite just because it's almost identical in terms of width and they both share a 6-inch screen. And again, it just shows how impressively compact the Win4 is. So let's get the Win4 on the scale and compare it in a different way. As you can see, the Win4 comes in at about 605 grams or about 1 pound 5 ounces. Next up is the ROG Ally, which are actually almost identical in weight, coming in at a similar 1 pound 5 ounces or about 612 grams. Next we have the Steam Deck, which will be the heaviest of the bunch at 676 grams or about 1 pound 8 ounces. And finally, the lightest of this group, the Nintendo Switch, coming in at 14 ounces or 398 grams. You can tell that the Win4, despite the compact size, is still packing some heft. So let's go ahead and take some measurements, and I just wanted to say before I size up the analog stick caps on the Win4 that while these are smaller, I do think that they are proportionally sized to the face of the device. The analog sticks are also not Switch style sticks that are so common nowadays, and so I do think these are really solid. Anyways, the analog sticks measure at a little over 13.5 millimeters in diameter. The face buttons are pretty small and come in at a little over 6mm. Next we have the Steam Deck, and its analog stick caps measure under 16mm in diameter, with its face buttons coming in at about 8.5mm. The ROG Ally comes in at 16mm for the analog stick cap, and the ROG Ally does have full-size face buttons matching the Xbox Series controller, coming in at just shy of 10mm. Finally, I quickly wanted to show the face buttons of the Joy-Cons, since most know these as being quite small, and at about 7mm these still manage to be a little larger than the face buttons on the Win4. I also wanted to measure the D-pad and see just how similar it is in size to the one on the Vita. The width of the D-pad on the Win4 measures just slightly over 19.5mm. And so let's take a look at the Vita one, and you can see that these are really close in terms of dimensions and nearly identical. Finally, I definitely wanted to measure the thickness of the device because the Win4, while compact in its width, is quite a chunky boy, and so you can see that GPD had to figure out different ways to get this down to a certain proportion, and therefore the Win4 gains a little in thickness, which also probably comes from the addition of the sliding mechanism, built-in keyboard, and just the stacking of the internal components in general. The Win4 measures in at about 28.5mm. The ROG Ally is next on the list, coming in at about 21mm. And finally, the Steam Deck at about 19mm in thickness. And here's a nice overhead view of all three x86 devices lined up, and you can see that despite the Win4 having that extra thickness, it's really not incredibly noticeable, and I do think it helps give it some better grip for comfort. And before we start our next segment, let's take a moment and stretch and enjoy this doggy break provided by Nala. And now it's time to grab some tools and get this unit opened up so we can peek inside and see how GPD managed to fit everything into this unit. So looking at the back, and we have 6 screws that need to be removed. These are using standard screws, but you will want to grab your thinnest bit as the opening is quite narrow. Nice, first try, and it looks like I got the right one. So let's quickly get these screws removed from the backplate. Now getting the backplate off was a little difficult for me. I managed to get just enough separation to create a space that I could put in a wedge tool or guitar pick to then start separating the tabs away from the rest of the device. This is definitely in place really well, and in particular on the bottom of the unit I found the tabs the hardest to separate. Now before you pry that backplate fully off, just be aware that there are 2 cables connected to the backplate. One is for the programmable buttons on the back, and the other is actually part of the Wi-Fi antenna, so just make sure to carefully disconnect those 2 cables. Okay, with those disconnected, let's check out this backplate. You can see that GPD did put a screen in place to prevent as much dust from getting into the intake vent, which is nice to see. The plastic is fairly bendable, which isn't honestly all that surprising. Alright, so let's get a closer look at the rest of the unit, and immediately you can see where some of that extra thickness comes into play, with the battery having stacked cells. There's quite a substantial fan in place as well. I think that it's certainly possible to make the device slightly thinner, but again, it will come at the expense of battery life, and I do know there are thinner fans that can move air just as well. Peeling back the protective sticker, and you can see that we have the 3900 mAh 45 Wh battery in place. Now these teardowns serve some important purposes, which includes ease of repair, and so I will look at things like how accessible and replaceable the battery is, as well as any components that can be modified. One thing that is quite common for these devices is replacing the NVMe drive, and so you can see that in order to gain complete access to the SSD, we will need to remove the fan, which is held into place by 2 screws and fairly simple to get out. Carefully peel back the tape at the top of the fan, and I recommend peeling it in a way that leaves it intact on the fan itself so it's easy to place back into the unit. Make sure to disconnect the ribbon cable at the bottom, and then the fan will separate fully from the device. Now you should have complete access to the SSD for any changes. One thing I noticed immediately on my unit was the sloppy application of the thermal compound, which isn't the biggest deal as this is clearly a non-conducive compound and won't present much issue. We also now have a good look at the heatsink that covers a good portion of the unit. This will also give us a good opportunity to take a look at the analog triggers and mechanism being used for them. So continuing on, I will remove the SSD from the unit so that I can check to see if there are any concealed screws below it so that I can remove the motherboard. Okay, so you're probably wondering why I haven't removed the battery yet, and unfortunately the ribbon cable that connects the battery to the mainboard is covered by one of the thermal plates on the mainboard, so we will have to first remove that. By the way, I've been using the same bit for all the screws. Okay, so with that out of the way, you might notice that now we have access to the connection for the battery, and so now we can get this removed. So just gently lift up the connection, and then you can pull the battery out of the device. There is a decently strong adhesive in place behind the battery, so give it a little force and it should separate. So here's a nice shot of the Win4 without the battery. Alright, now we can remove the heatsink, which is held in place with 3 additional screws. You can definitely see that way too much thermal compound was applied here, and it was also quite a sloppy application, but it's a good thing it's not conducive, or else things would be very interesting. So here's a closer look at our Ryzen 7 6800U. Let's peel this tape off and then fully reveal the motherboard of the Win4. Now you'll notice that the motherboard will have to be removed in order to access the face buttons and right side analog stick, as they're going to be underneath it. The analog stick and D-pad, however, are accessible, as you can see. So there are a few ribbon cables that need to be disconnected before removing the main board, which is held in place by 5 screws. Once all of that has been disconnected and removed, the main board will separate from the shell. However, take caution, as the display cable is connected on the back of the motherboard. I do like that the display cable is very flexible, so we shouldn't see any issues with that failing over repeated use. So with all of these steps, you finally will have access to the analog stick on the right side, and this is where we will stop with this teardown. And so now we have a good idea of what is expected if some of these critical components would need to be changed or replaced in the future. I will say that there is some impressive engineering going on here with just how everything has been placed and designed with all these components in mind in a compact size. And with all of that, it's time to shift over to gaming performance, and as always, I like to start this part off with some synthetic benchmarks to get some idea of what to expect here and for reference as well. The tests were conducted at the preset of 28 watts to get an idea of the top end performance of the Win4. First up is Geekbench 6, and the Win4 scored 1,797 in this single core and 8,383 for the multi-core score. Finally, the 3D Mark Time Spy benchmark, and the Win4 scored overall a 2,696 with the graphics score of 2,418 and the CPU score of 7,739. These numbers are all very much in line with what we should expect from the Ryzen 7 6800U. Alright, with the numbers and the synthetic benchmarks out of the way, it's time to get into some real world performance and check out how that Win4 handles some PC gaming first. So first up is the remake of Resident Evil 4, and I partly wanted to include this game because it is a 2023 release and demonstrate how the 6800U can handle some of these newer releases. And I have to say I'm very pleased with the performance of this one on the Win4, and for this specific footage I have the Win4 set to 15 watts using FSR2 with the quality preset set at 720p, and I locked the frame rate to 30, and the game runs great and looks really nice on the 6-inch screen. Now I chose 16 watts to also demonstrate that games like Resident Evil 4 are playable at this setting while balancing both battery life and performance. And speaking of 2023 releases, here is the Lies of P demo, and while the final game will be coming out later this year, it is a 2023 release, and so I wanted to see what we could potentially expect from future titles. I have to say I am blown away by the performance of the Lies of P demo. Now footage is set to 15 watts again, and it's running at 60 frames per second with low settings set to 720p. However, I have been able to play this one set to as low as 10 watts, and so it's obvious this game is nicely optimized, and there is plenty of headroom here to tweak settings to the way you like. Finally, I wanted to go with an older PC release and one of my personal favorites, which is Spider-Man Miles Morales, and I'm really glad that it got a port to PC, and a pretty solid one at that. For this game, I am using 15 watts again, and I have the game set to 720p and capped at 30 frames per second while using AMD's FSR 2.1, with a mixture of low and medium settings, and the game does very well at these settings, and it does give us a good indication that we can scale back the power a little bit to get more battery performance, and I did test down to about 10 watts, but found that 12 watts is about where you'd end up with this one.
Too easy. Maybe he's a weak-minded. Oh! Hey, Jonah, look at that! Very fast! Malice! A feckless, treacherous, unhinged!
So let's shift gears and move over to emulation and check out some of the higher end consoles that we can emulate with Windows. We will start with some PlayStation 3 emulation using RPCS3, and first up is Hardcore Uprising, which is a lighter game, and so it's a good one to start out with. This is an awesome run and gun shooter, part of the Contra franchise, and comes to us from Arc System Works, who you might better know for their work on Guilty Gear. As you can see, this one has no issues running on the Win4. So let's take it up a notch and check out a more demanding game. Here's Ratchet & Clank Tools of Destruction, and surprisingly I found the game to run pretty well at 12 watts. It does have occasional hiccups, mostly because of shader compilation, and this game will switch from 30 to 60 frames, but I was pleasantly surprised to see it running this well at 12 watts, which will be good for battery performance. Finally, I wanted to check out MotorStorm Pacific Rift, and this is a pretty demanding game to emulate, and on the Win4 I did need to set the TDP to 18 watts. I went back and forth between 18 watts and 20 watts, but I found that it is pretty solid at 18 watts, and because this is a game that runs at 30 frames per second, I think we can get away with leaving it at this setting, since it does seem to stay very close to that number. Okay, time to switch over to the other 7th generation console, the Xbox 360 with Xenia Canary, and let's first check out Splosion Man, which is still an Xbox 360 console exclusive as it has surprisingly never been ported to PC or anywhere else. I wasn't all too surprised that this one will run, and I do have this game set to use 10 watts, which I think is absolutely amazing that we're able to do Xbox 360 emulation at this setting. And here's one of my favorite franchises, Burnout, and this is specifically Burnout Revenge, and the 360 version is kinda neat because it is the only 7th generation version of the game, as the other versions of Revenge were on the prior generation consoles. This one also really surprised me by its performance, and in the footage, it's running at 11 watts, even though I actually had wanted to test it at 12 watts, but I guess we can't complain since this is a pretty impressive result. Now let's check out the other Xbox console with some XEMU emulating the original Xbox, and first up is an awesome and probably forgotten franchise by now for most, Amped 2, and this one performs incredibly well in XEMU, and I have the Win4 set to 8 watts, and it's holding that 60 frames per second very well. Now let's check out one of my absolute favorite games that still remains on the original Xbox. Panzer Dragoon Orta is definitely a bit more demanding for XEMU, and so for this one I needed to turn it up to about 12 watts to get the performance that you are seeing here, which I think is still quite good. Okay, now on the Nintendo side, let's first check out Wii U emulation with Cemu, and I'll start as I usually do with a lighter game, and here is Nano Assault Neo from a studio I have talked about quite a bit on my channel, Shinin, who is responsible for games like Fast Racing. This is a very fun twin-stick shooter game that does incredibly well in Cemu, and for this one I have the Win4 set to only 8 watts, which is just absolutely bonkers that we're doing Wii U emulation at 8 watts. And because we're on a Windows device with access to Cemu, let's skip the usual GameCube version of Wind Waker and go straight into the remastered version, Wind Waker HD, which looks gorgeous and is another game that performs very well. The Win4 is set to 10 watts for this game, and I do think some later areas in the game will probably need a small bump in power, but overall this runs great. Finally, the last console that's part of our emulation testing with Switch using the Yuzu emulator. So I wanted to change it up and feature a game a little different than usual, and so I went with Crash Team Racing Nitro Fueled, and I selected this one partly because this is the only way to actually play the game on PC, since for whatever reason this never got a port to the PC, which is a shame as it's an awesome remaster of the original PlayStation game. And like most of the other emulation tests, this one was a nice surprise not only because it runs well, but the Win4 is set to 10 watts for the footage that you are seeing on display. And finally, we can't show off some Yuzu without a little bit of Super Mario Odyssey, and this one is definitely more demanding, needing 15 watts to run the way you are seeing here. And this will have the occasional stutter, mostly due to the shader compilation, which is normal. I will say that I looked at Mario Odyssey on this same 6800U back on the WinMax 2, and it is really incredible to see how far Yuzu has come just in that time since, because Odyssey is running incredibly well on the 6800U. And of course, with all of this gaming, you're probably wondering what kind of battery life can you expect. And so I went ahead and tested at various power presets to give a good range of what to expect with the Win4. All tests were conducted at 50% brightness and 50% volume with Wi-Fi and Bluetooth turned on. First, let's start with the more demanding test, and on the left you can see that using the preset of 28 watts in Motion Assistant and using the Liza P demo with settings turned up quite a bit, the Win4 just misses out getting to that 1 hour of battery life, and not too unexpected here, and this is definitely not a setting I recommend using when on the go. Now on the right side, we have the more realistic 15 watt test, and again using the Liza P demo with settings appropriately adjusted, we did get about an hour extra battery life, coming in at a little over 1 hour and 40 minutes. I think for most PC gaming, you will want to be around the 15 to 18 watt setting to maximize battery life, but also to be able to play more demanding games as needed. Unfortunately, x86 devices continue to be plagued by battery life when needing that extra power. And finally, my lightest test and a return to Yoshi's Island with the Win4 set to 5 watts, and we were able to get almost 6 hours of battery life, and I do think that's pretty solid performance, and so lighter emulation and indie games will do quite well around this TDP. Lastly, I always like to take surface temperatures of a device after gaming on it for some time, and as I mentioned, the fan is definitely doing a good job moving a lot of that heat away from the device. The hottest temperature I observed on the surface of the Win4 was about 44 degrees Celsius, which is a bit on the warmer side, and in particular I noticed this on the right side where you hold the device, and I found it to be noticeably warmer. The rest of the unit seems to stay under 40 degrees Celsius, with the coolest spot naturally being in the center on the back where the massive intake vent is. And so we're starting to reach the end of this journey exploring the Win4. I have to say that at this point, the number of devices that have shipped with the 6800U is nearly endless. However, I think that out of the many choices, GPD has served up two unique options with the WinMax 2 and now the Win4. I've mentioned this in the past, but I really do believe that in order for some of these Chinese companies to compete, they will need to be focusing on unique form factors or filling specific niches that help them stand out. I think that GPD has done just that with the Win4, and its compact size, built-in keyboard, and awesome optical pointer are all strong features that make their product stand out among the others. It's not all perfect though, and like some of its competitors, the Win4 does have its own unique quirks. I did find at times that Windows didn't behave all that well for me, and I'm quite comfortable with Windows, which tells me that someone who isn't as experienced will become frustrated by some of the downfalls that come with a Windows handheld, and of course this isn't only a Win4 problem, and many Windows handhelds suffer from the same issue. However, the software that comes with the Win4 from GPD, while certainly usable, can be annoying to deal with when you enjoy switching power profiles on the fly, and perhaps you are tinkering to find the best profile for certain games. It is a cumbersome experience, and adding software like Handheld Control Panel can definitely make that experience better by providing a proper overlay, but even then it isn't a perfect piece of software, and it does have its own issues. Finally, GPD is going to be launching the Ryzen 7640U and 7840U variant refresh of the Win4, which should be shipping in the next few months. But it's not all doom and gloom for the 6800U model, as it's still quite performant, and for someone that doesn't need the absolute latest technology, a 6800U Win4 could be a very good purchase, especially as prices keep coming down on new units and on the second-hand market. For someone looking to get into the Win4 form factor at the lowest possible price, the 6800U model will still serve most of your performance needs, and I do think there is still some headroom in that 6800U, and I will be following up with a demonstration of this in the near future. Until then, head over to the comments section and let me know what you think about the Win4 and its form factor. Is this the kind of size that you want to see in a Windows handheld, or do you prefer larger screen experiences when dealing with Windows? As always, I am the Retro Tech Dad, and thank you so much for watching.